We can ensure that CHAMP will be able to put this weapon in the field years ahead of schedule and at a lower cost, while also continuing to develop a longer-term solution. It's a shame that fixing every government program isn't as simple as this. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Indiana.
I would rise in opposition to the gentleman's amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I appreciate the recognition and rise in opposition because of where the funds for the gentleman's amendment is coming from. The amendment would use funds from a committee priority, the Defense Rapid Innovation Program. This program emphasizes technology development issues done primarily through small businesses. And certainly in my short time as ranking member on this subcommittee, I have been impressed by the lack of a true small business program at the Department of Defense, despite their protestations. DoD's track record of support for small businesses must be improved for many reasons, not the least of which is the fertile ground that small businesses provide to solve major issues for the Department. In the 2 years of program execution so far, fiscal years 2011 and 2012, the Department of Defense has received over 3,000 proposals for funding. This includes 2,200 proposals from small businesses across America for fiscal year 2012 funding for completion and execution this year. So again, my concern is where the money is coming from in this amendment and strongly oppose the gentleman's amendment, and I would yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, all I can tell you is this, is that the offset from the Rapid Innovation Fund, currently I think the outlay rate for the first year was 43% from that fund. This is a ready project. This is actually one that the Air Force has tested in a positive manner with positive results in regards to actually eliminating a threat without destroying the building or without destroying lives. And if we had something like this when we went into Iraq or that area, we possibly could have done something without having to rebuild an entire infrastructure while still doing what we needed to do to be able to do our military mission. And with this, all I can tell you, Mr. Chairman, is that it is in fact a program that is working. It just needs a delivery vehicle. This is offset in regards to no additional funding or spending is required other than what comes from that fund that is sitting there, and that's what that Rapid Development Fund was actually designed for. So with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Florida yields back his time. Question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Request recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida will be postponed. It is now in order to consider amendment number 18, printed in House Report 113170. What purpose does the gentleman from Nevada seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 18, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Mr. Heck of Nevada.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Heck, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Nevada.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since its inception, the Iron Dome system has achieved tremendous success defeating rockets fired at the State of Israel from the Gaza Strip, and I am pleased that the underlying bill supports the President's request and fully funds this critical program. However, despite significant investments in this vital program, the United States has no rights to any of the proprietary information associated with that system. My amendment would provide $15 million for the Israeli Iron Dome short rocket defense system to initiate co-production of missile interceptors in the United States. This is $15 million in addition to the funds appropriated to support Israel's Iron Dome program to help ensure that the U.S. has a role in future production and can leverage the technology that we have invested in. Specifically, these funds will support the infrastructure, tooling, transferring data, special test equipment, and related components for U.S. production. This amendment will help stabilize U.S. manufacturers who are facing an uncertain future with U.S. military procurement shrinking in the face of sequestration. By increasing opportunities for U.S. manufacturers, we will help support our nation's struggling economy while supporting and creating critical jobs here at home. This funding will also provide a second source of production for Israel, who can leverage the rate production capabilities of American firms to ensure that necessary quantities of Iron Dome interceptors are fielded as rapidly as possible. Providing this funding will ensure that our most critical ally in the Middle East, Israel, has the necessary capacity to defend itself against rocket attacks launched by Hamas. In March of 2013, during President Obama's trip to Israel, the commander of the Israeli Air Defense Command, Brigadier General Shohat, spoke of the need for U.S. co-production of Iron Dome missile interceptors. In response to concerns about future missile interceptor shortfalls and the desire to increase Israel's Iron Dome deployment from 5 to 13 batteries, the general stated, quote, what would be impacted is the pace at which we equip ourselves. The bottom line is I need as many air defense units as possible and as quickly as possible. By accepting this amendment, the House will ensure that Israel has the capability as well as the capacity to defend itself. Further, in written testimony provided to the House Armed Services Strategic Forces Subcommittee, Director of the Missile Defense Agency, Vice Admiral James Searing, indicated that the Missile Defense Agency was actively seeking Iron Dome co-production opportunities and was negotiating to obtain available technical data packages and data rights. This amendment will ensure that funding is available to move forward on this important effort. During consideration of H.R. 1960, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2014 by the House Armed Services Committee, I offered an amendment to authorize funding for co-production of Iron Dome, which was unanimously agreed to. Additionally, the House of Representatives authorized this funding when it voted to pass the fiscal year 2014 NDAA last month. Finally, Mr. Chairman, in order to offset the cost of this co-production, my amendment reduces 2 applied research programs within the defense-wide RDTE. Specifically, it reduces applied research in joint munitions technology by $5 million and reduces funding for applied research in chemical and biological defense programs by $10 million. These modest reductions conform to the funding levels authorized in the National Defense Authorization Act and ensures that these programs still receive adequate and appropriate funding. Mr. Chairman, my amendment ensures that Israel has the capacity to defend itself while providing the U.S. the ability to leverage our significant investments in Israel's Iron Dome short-range rocket defense program. I urge my colleagues to support this common-sense amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from New Jersey.
I rise, Mr. Chairman, to claim time. Speak on the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, this Israeli cooperative program is an important program, and the Israelis are very good and loyal allies of ours, so we support the gentleman's amendment. Yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Nevada is recognized.
I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Nevada. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 19, printed in House Report 113-170. What purpose does the gentlewoman from New Mexico seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 19, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Ms. Michelle Lujan Grisham of New Mexico.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentlewoman from New Mexico, Ms. Lujan Grisham, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from New Mexico.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to thank the Chair for the opportunity to speak on this amendment. In 1990, the existing U.S. satellite communications capacity would not support the warfighters during the first Gulf War. The United States made an urgent attempt to launch an additional defense satellite communications system 3 spacecraft to support the war effort. But it was not until February 11, 1992, more than a year after the war ended, that the mission was finally finally launched. In nearly every national space policy guidance document, resiliency and responsiveness are key objectives in global communications, navigation, and guided munitions, all of which rely on satellites that provide game-changing advantages on the battlefield. Before operationally responsive space, ORS, was established, the capacity to rapidly develop and deploy satellites was inadequate. ORS's mission is to respond to emerging, persistent, or unanticipated needs and quickly deploy cost-effective satellites to provide transformational advantages on the battlefield. ORS has the ability to launch field-ready satellites within just a few days or weeks. It also rapidly develops, delivers, and employs new capabilities in a few months to less than a year. Increased speed for the delivery of space assets not only helps to close gaps in the United States space system's capacity, it can also improve resiliency and reconstitute satellites lost to countermeasures. In 2007, China used a ground-based missile to destroy one of its own satellites, demonstrating their capacity to target our satellites and space defense systems. Russia is currently developing a sea-based missile and space defense system. As other countries modernize their military, the threat level to our communications, navigation, and guided munitions satellites intensifies. ORS has also demonstrated the ability to cost-effectively deploy space assets. General Schwartz said, ORS is exactly what we need, innovation and greater efficiency as we contend with ongoing fiscal constraints and changing space posture. Secretary of the Air Force Michael Donnelly called ORS critical to our nation's national security posture, and we need to proceed at the speed of need. Eliminating ORS would cut the very programs that give our nation's warfighters their military asymmetric advantage in space. The growing need for information dominance is driving a remarkable transition in space systems. ORS is integral to maintaining our advantage in space. Our amendment reserves $10 million from RDT&E for this program. Now, Mr. Chairman, I thank the Chair and the ranking member, and I look forward to continue to work on this important issue. With that,
If the gentlewoman would yield, please.
Yes, I yield.
I appreciate the gentlewoman yielding, and would point out to my colleagues that on this particular issue she has been dogged, and do believe this is one of a number of items within the bill where reasonable people can have a disagreement. Certainly the position that my colleague has from New Mexico is that she believes she has the most cost-effective approach that the United States Air Force should take. The problem that we face on the subcommittee, given the financial and fiscal constraints we have, is that the Air Force did not ask for funding for this program for fiscal year 2013 or 2014, and so we deferred. But appreciate her concern and appreciate her raising it to the body without making any representations as to what the future holds, but again would commend her for her work on this program and again her doggedness on behalf of it. And I appreciate the gentlewoman for yielding.
Thank
Gentlewoman from New Mexico.
And Mr. Chairman, with that, I withdraw my amendment.
The amendment is withdrawn.
Thank you.
It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 20, printed in House Report 113-170. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 20, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Mr. Nadler of New York.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to support the Nadler-Garamendi-Polis amendment to eliminate additional funding for new cost. Oh, I yield myself 2 minutes.
I was recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. I urge my colleagues to support the Nadler-Garamendi-Polis amendment to eliminate additional funding for a new, costly, unproven, and unnecessary missile defense site. Our amendment would cut $70 million that was added by the Appropriations Committee for an East Coast missile defense system that the Pentagon says it does not want or need. In a June 10th letter to Senate Armed Services Committee Chairman Carl Levin, Vice Admiral James Syring, Director of the Missile Defense Agency, and Lieutenant General Richard Formica, Commander of the Joint Functional Command for Integrated Missile Defense, unequivocally stated, quote, "There is no validated military requirement to deploy an East Coast missile defense site." I ask unanimous consent for this letter to be submitted for the record.
The gentleman's request will be covered by general leave.
Thank you. Admiral Syring told the House Armed Services Committee earlier this year that he would not be able to use additional funds for an East Coast site this year because the Pentagon has only begun to study the concept, and the Pentagon already has the funding it needs for this study in FY 2014. Furthermore, the technology is still unproven at this time. There have been no successful intercept tests for the past 5 years of the system that might be deployed on the East Coast. The recent test failure of the ground-based mid-course system that will be deployed on the East Coast is another reason not to rush forward with deployment. In a time of budget deficits and looming sequester funds, we cannot afford to spend money on a program that the military says it does not yet need and does not yet work. The Pentagon says the current system, based on Alaska and California, is sufficient to defend the entire continental United States against a limited attack from North Korea and Iran. The CBO says an East Coast base would cost approximately $3.5 billion over the next 5 years, and that the Admiral and General said there are currently more cost-effective and less expensive alternatives to improving the defense of the U.S. homeland than an East Coast missile site. It's a pure waste of money to deploy a missile defense site on the East Coast before a need for such a site is identified and before the interceptors can be proved effective and suitable in operationally realistic tests. So we should not have this funding now. And 2 minutes? I thank the I reserve the balance of my time, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Arizona.
Mr. Chairman, I would claim time in opposition.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to the amendment from the gentleman from New York. 2 presidents and 3 secretaries of defense recognize the advantage of an additional missile defense site. Mr. Chairman, I would yield myself 2.5 minutes, incidentally.
How much time?
2.5 minutes.
Gentleman's recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For a more effective defense along range missile threats from the Middle East, President Bush wanted to deploy 10 ground-based interceptors in Poland. President Obama wanted to deploy 24 SM-3 Block 2B missiles in Poland. But I would remind my colleague from New York that the additional idea of a homeland defense site is bipartisan and was supported by President Obama as recently as this March. But Mr. Obama changed his mind with the cancellation of the SM-3 Block 2B missiles intended for Poland in 2020, and now we no longer have a 3rd homeland defense site, which the Obama administration supported prior to March 15th. The termination of the SM-3 Block 2B missile intended for Poland now means defense of the homeland against ICBM threats from the Middle East will not be as strong as originally sought by this president. That's this president, Mr. Chairman, President Obama, who has cut missile defense every time he's had the opportunity since he started in the face of a growing threat while the centrifuges in Iran continue to spin. The warfighters agree on the East Coast site that it adds to the defense of the United States. General Jacoby, the NORTHCOM commander, said, "What a 3rd site gives me, whether it's on the East Coast or an alternate location, would be increased battle space. That means an increased opportunity for me to engage threats either from Iran or North Korea." Mr. Chairman, it's a very simple matter of telemetry and geography. The East Coast site would allow us much greater battle space and not have to make our West Coast sites travel the entire length of the continent in order to engage a potential incoming Iranian missile. And, Mr. Chairman, I continue just to sometimes be amazed. This is the most dangerous kinds of threat that we face in America. The first purpose of this body is to make sure that the country's defenses are taken care of and that we provide for the national security of this country. And yet, in a growing threat environment, my colleagues on the other side continue to want to cut missile defense. And, Mr. Chairman, I would urge the defeat of this amendment, and I would reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Arizona reserves. Gentleman from New York.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, and my good friends who serve on these committees with me, This is not about the President, and this is not about missile defense. This is about the unnecessary expenditure of a very important national asset, our money. Testimony given in committee indicates that we may or may not need an East Coast missile defense site. And we also know that the current missiles that are being used for these anti-ballistic missiles don't work. At least there's a failure, and there's been repeated failures just in the boost system, let alone whether we can hit a rock with a rock. So the problem here is this money should not be spent now for this site. It is absolutely clear the Department of Defense from last year's budget and appropriation has sufficient money to determine where to locate a site. With regard to the cancellation of the missile that was discussed a few moments ago, it doesn't fit in the existing sites. And so they canceled it because it doesn't fit in the hole in the ground. So what are we doing here? This is $70 million, not a vast amount of money when considering the appropriation for the Department of Defense, but that's $70 million that can be used to, well, how about protecting a levee, some city in the United States? It could be used to much better effect. There was another amendment that I understand that failed that took another $100 million or so out of this particular thing. We ought to be taking what money is available and putting it into something that actually might work, which would be directed energy. But an amendment for directed energy was refused an opportunity to be heard on the floor. So we really ought to be thinking seriously about how we move forward with this. I have great respect for my colleagues, but we ought not just throw money after other money. And so I yield back.
Gentleman from New York reserves.
I reserve it.
Gentleman from Arizona.
Mr. Chairman, I would now yield 2.5 minutes to the distinguished chairman of the Strategic Forces Committee, Mr. Rogers from Alabama.
Gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
I thank the gentleman, and I too rise in opposition to this amendment. According to the Missile Defense Agency estimates provided in 2012, the cost of 20 silo GBI sites, that's including missiles, is approximately $3 billion and could be built over a 5 to 6 year period of time. This cost is almost half the funding the administration has stripped from MDA in the past 2 years. These funds are critical today. Iran will not slow down its ballistic missile program just because the gentleman wants to cut the funds for our defense. They are testing rocket engines and missiles now. The Department of Defense tells us also that Iran continues to advance its space launch and longer-range ballistic missile capabilities. Iran has used a space launch vehicle, the Sapphire II, to place a satellite in orbit, demonstrating some of the key technologies required for an ICBM to be successfully developed. This was reaffirmed recently by the latest biannual report from NASIC, the leading experts on ballistic missile intelligence. General Jacoby, commander of the U.S. Northern Command, stated, quote, "We should consider that Iran has capability within the next few years of flight testing ICBM-capable technologies, and, quote, the Iranians are intent on developing an ICBM," close quote. And the Missile Defense Agency's own illustrative briefings to the House Armed Services Committee have shown that MDA planned to spend funds like those appropriated in Chairman Young's mark while site selection and EIS processes were underway. These funds absolutely can be spent today. That the administration didn't request them is dispositive of nothing. Chairman Young showed leadership in adding these funds to match those provided by the FY14 NDAA. I thank him for that support, and I urge the defeat of the Nadler-Garamendi-Polis amendment. Now I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Arizona.
Reserve.
Gentleman reserved. Gentleman from New York.
I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from California.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 30 seconds.
I have great respect for my colleagues on the subcommittee. However, it's incomplete, the argument that's been made. We're talking about whether we're going to spend an additional sum of money this next year on a program that, A, has large questions about whether it works, and B, the military doesn't need the money right now. If you remember the committee hearing, if the gentleman remembered the committee hearing, Mr. Chairman, the general said he didn't need more money now. He had sufficient money from this year's appropriation that next year, carrying on the studies that are necessary as to where to locate the site, and it may not be on the East Coast. It may be elsewhere.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York has 30 seconds remaining. The gentleman from Arizona has 30 seconds remaining. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, the gentleman said that the testimony was that they did not need the money today for additional testing or for additional, but they do need the money today for deployment, Mr. Chairman. This administration, throughout its tenure, has weakened our missile defense capabilities that protect us against the most dangerous weapons in the history of humanity. And, Mr. Chairman, we should not continue to go down that road, and I would urge my colleagues to defeat this amendment, and with that I would yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the remaining time.
Gentleman is recognized for 30 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, the question is, will we waste the money? We are told by the Director of the Missile Defense Agency and the General Commanding the Joint Functional Command that they cannot use the money. There's no validated military requirement to deploy an East Coast missile defense site, and that he would not be able to use additional funds for an East Coast site this year because they've only begun to study the concept. It may be that in the future we may want an East Coast site. But to appropriate this money now is a pure waste of money because now they're simply studying the concept. They can't spend it. They probably won't spend it. Why waste the money? I urge people to vote for this amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Gentleman from New York.
I ask for the recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York are postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 21, printed in House Report 113-170. What purpose does the gentlewoman from New Hampshire seek recognition? Does the gentlelady from New Hampshire offer the amendment? Yes, I do. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 21, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Ms. Shea Porter of New Hampshire.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentlewoman from New Hampshire, Ms. Shea Porter, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, I'm offering an amendment with my colleague, Congressman Lobiondo, to support veterans with PTSD and traumatic brain injury, or TBI. This amendment designates $4.5 million within the peer-reviewed traumatic brain injury and psychological health research account for a 3-year study to evaluate the therapeutic service dog training program currently operating at the National Intrepid Center of Excellence and Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. This innovative service member dog training program is designed to be a safe, effective, non-drug intervention to treat the symptoms of PTSD and TBI. Service members report improvements in their PTSD or TBI symptoms when participating in the therapeutic service dog training program. The servicemen and women involved in this program report a number of positive results, including lower levels of depression, improved self-control, improved sleep patterns, a greater sense of purpose, better reintegration into their communities, pain reduction, and improved parenting skills. This year's NDAA House report directed the Secretary of Defense to conduct whatever studies are necessary to evaluate this promising program. This amendment provides the resources for such a study. There is now considerable anecdotal evidence that training service dogs reduces the PTSD symptoms of their warrior trainers and that the presence of the dogs increases the sense of well-being in service members and their families. The most eloquent testimonials are from service member trainees themselves. One said, "It's been great working with the dogs. They're helping me with my depression, anxiety, and sleep. With a dog at my side, my stress measurements returned to normal for the first time." Another, It's great knowing that I'm helping to train a service dog for a service member who has physical disabilities. Another, it's hard for me to put into words how very important working with these dogs has been to me. Working with the dogs gave me a purpose again and a way to continue to give back to soldiers. Training these dogs helps me rebuild my confidence level and to feel that I'm functioning as an effective member of the Army and of society. And one more, the dog I'm training bonded quickly with my daughter and me. The dog allowed us to connect in a very positive way. Working with the dog has taught me patience, which also carries over to being a parent. And finally, going out into crowded public place has been very hard for me. However, to train a service dog, you have to lead them confidently through places like grocery stores and an underground train. I find that while I'm teaching the young dogs how to navigate these places, I am much more comfortable as well. I'm even learning how to enjoy interaction with strangers who approach me to talk about the dog. The soldier also noted, being allowed to sleep with the dog that I'm training has been very helpful. I had been only managing to sleep a couple hours a night before being cleared to have a dog spend the night with me. That night I slept almost 6 hours and I had no nightmares. I awake so much more refreshed. My wife has noted the improvement as well. The dogs that these service members with PTSD train become highly skilled service dogs for veterans with disabilities, while the warrior trainers reap the therapeutic benefits of training them. This amendment is a win-win-win. It's good for returning vets, it helps combat PTSD, and it doesn't add a dime to the deficit. I and Congressman Lobiondo urge you to support these promising research efforts, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim time to speak on the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
We're pleased to accept the amendment. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Pursuant to House, or the Chair now, excuse me. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from New Hampshire. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It's now in order to consider Amendment Number 22, printed in House Report 113-170. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition? I have an amendment at the desk. Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 22, printed in House Report Number 113-170, offered by Mr. O'Rourke of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. O'Rourke, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
I thank the Chair. Chair, my amendment aims to provide the Department of Defense with additional budgetary flexibility, should they need it, to guarantee that the resources are available to properly maintain family housing at our military installations. Section 8058 of this legislation prohibits funds from being used to repair or maintain military family housing. My amendment would strike that provision and, I believe, provide needed flexibility at a time of austere budgets and sequester. I represent Fort Bliss, one of the largest installations in the Army. There are over 3,700 homes on Fort Bliss, and my community, El Paso, Texas, takes immense pride in creating a high quality of life for all those who serve at Fort Bliss. We have an obligation to our service members and their families to ensure they have first-rate housing. It is good for morale, and it is the right thing to do. I understand that funds for repair and maintenance are included in the Military Construction VA Appropriations Bill. My goal is simply to do everything we can to protect our service members and fulfill our responsibility to them. I know that the Chair and the Ranking Member share my goal. I am prepared to withdraw my amendment, and I would hope the Chair and Ranking Member would be willing to work with me going forward to continue providing our service members and their families first-rate housing. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from Florida.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I claim the time and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman recognized from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the Chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. It's now in order to consider Amendment Number 23, printed in House Report 113-170. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition? Does the gentleman offer the amendment? Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 23, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Mr. Moran of Virginia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Moran, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will yield myself 3 minutes to begin with. Mr. Chairman, the political and legal expediency of the detention center at Guantanamo, Cuba, has not been worth the cost to America's reputation around the world, nor to the erosion of our legal and ethical standards here at home. My amendment would enable the U.S. military to transfer or release the detainees who have been cleared by the intelligence community and the Joint Chiefs of Staff to their home countries, and bring those not cleared for release to the United States to be charged, tried, and sentenced. Those who advocate the continuance of Guantanamo don't seem to realize that so many of the prisoners still held at Guantanamo were in fact wrongly captured. The majority never engaged in hostile actions against the United States or its allies. But the fact is that we know today Guantanamo continues to serve as a rallying cry for extremists around the world. And until we transfer and try the detainees, there is no denying that Guantanamo is hurting our national security. We need to reevaluate our approach to the long-term threat of terrorism and realize that policies that mock the concept of equal justice under the law and that undermine our respect for human rights make it more likely rather than less likely that we will be attacked again. How can we expect Americans held captive abroad to be accorded the right to be sentenced and brought to trial when we hold 166 prisoners in Guantanamo without charge and without trial? 86% of the Guantanamo detainees were captured in exchange for a bounty, in many cases a very large bounty that represented a whole year's pay for the people turning them in. The majority of them, as I say, have never committed hostile acts against the U.S. or its coalition allies, and yet they have been held for more than 12 years without charge. My colleagues like to argue that detaining or trying suspected terrorists in the U.S. would endanger national security, but that's simply not true. More than 400 defendants charged with terrorism crimes have been successfully convicted in the United States since 9/11. Including a former Gitmo detainee who was tried in New York City, the Times Square bomber, the shoe bomber, Zacarias Moussaoui, who conspired to kill innocent Americans in 9/11. They've all been charged, they've all been tried, they've all been convicted. All of them here in the United States, and no security incidents. More than 300 individuals convicted of crimes of international terrorism are today incarcerated in 98 federal prisons within the United States, with no escapes or attacks in attempts to free them. There are 6 Department of Defense facilities where Guantanamo detainees could be held in the United States that are currently only at 48% capacity. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield myself another minute.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Now, it should be said in the context of an appropriations bill how expensive it is to keep Guantanamo open. We're currently spending $1.6 million per detainee, compared to $34,000 per inmate at a high-security federal prison here in the United States. And in the defense authorization, we just provided another $260 million in operations costs and another $186 million for construction to continue this temporary facility, almost $500 million. This does not make sense. And now we've got the hunger strikes because people see no future ahead of them. They're afraid that they'll be jailed indefinitely for charges that they can't even defend because they haven't even been given. That's not who we are as a nation. We're a nation of law. We're a nation of respect for human life. But to hold these detainees, and in some cases 46 of them are being tube-fed, strapped down for hours while a tube is inserted down their nose, that's not what we do. So let's stop it. Let's close down Guantanamo and do the right thing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this, I'll yield unless the other side wants to speak, I can retain the value.
Does the gentleman reserve or does the gentleman yield?
I'll reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Chairman, I claim the time in opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
And I would like to stop by saying that Mr. Moran is a very important member of the Defense Subcommittee. And he and I have very few differences, except on this one issue where we have a strong disagreement. The language that is in the bill that he would strike is the same as the language that we've been carrying now since FY 2010, and it is the same language that was included in the National Defense Authorization Act that the House passed earlier this year. The provisions that we include ensure that the remaining Gitmo detainees who are most judged as the most dangerous will never be released or otherwise brought into our homeland where U.S. citizens could be threatened. Second, they ensure that prior to releasing a Guantanamo detainee to a foreign country, a careful and deliberate assessment must be made that the detainee is not likely to re-engage in terrorist activity, and the foreign government can maintain control over that individual. Unfortunately, we have already seen an alarmingly high rate for Gitmo detainees to return to the battlefield. These detainees have posed direct threats to the U.S. personnel and U.S. interests, a threat that could only grow as we draw down from Afghanistan if they are able to establish safe havens to plot against the United States. The single greatest threat to the U.S. homeland and interests abroad currently is Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, a group established and run by two foreign Gitmo detainees that were released under a previous administration. The current law provisions in the bill reflect the right balance on this important issue. And I think a no vote is appropriate. A no vote is keeping in contact with the House position, as have been stated many times over. And so, rather than give these bad guys an opportunity to go back home or to go back to some other country adjacent to their home and allow them to get involved in recreating a danger, a threat to our troops and our interests wherever they might be, I just think it's not smart to remove the language from the bill that we already have. And so I oppose this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized. The gentleman from Virginia has 1 minute remaining.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 45 seconds to the distinguished member of the Judiciary Committee from New York, Mr. Nadler.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 45 seconds.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of this amendment, which would remove the existing limitations on transferring detainees out of Guantanamo. Our federal courts have a proven record of prosecuting terrorists, and our federal prison system is already imprisoning hundreds of convicted terrorists in facilities here in the United States. It makes no sense to have an external facility, especially one in Cuba, of all places. Guantanamo is a continuing stain on our national honor. It should be closed now. Of the 166 detainees at Guantanamo, 86 have been cleared for release. That is to say, they have been found guilty of nothing and judged to pose no danger. There is no reason and no right for us to hold them further. The detainees will gain no additional rights by being held in the United States. The Supreme Court has ruled that detainees have the same constitutional rights at Guantanamo as they do here. We cannot hold people indefinitely, people who may not be terrorists, who may be guilty of nothing. We must restore who we are and vote for this amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Virginia. Gentleman from Virginia has 15 seconds.
Mr. Chairman, I'll yield the remaining time to my friend, the ranking member, Mr. Visklosky.
I appreciate the gentleman yielding and simply would reiterate that in my opening statements indicated that I do believe the language in the bill and the limitations are a mistake. Guantanamo Bay ought to be closed. It is not constructive. And I do not believe at this point in time it is constitutional, and so do support the gentleman's amendment.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, these detainees are detained for a reason, and the reason is they either hurt, killed, or threatened our American troops or our American interests. That's why they're there at Guantanamo in the first place. It just doesn't seem right to me to send them back to the battlefield to threaten more troops, to threaten the lives of more soldiers. It's just not right, and it's not a good amendment. And I suggest that we should defeat this amendment right where we stand. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Chairman, I'd ask for a roll call vote on that.
Gentleman asks for a recorded vote. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia will be postponed. It is now in order to consider amendment number 24, printed in House Report 113-170. For what purpose does the gentleman from Nebraska seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk I wish to offer.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 24, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Mr. Terry of Nebraska.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Nebraska.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I am proud to represent Omaha and its surrounding areas. It has a magnificent base with extremely important missions. What that means is that I represent not only uniformed members who serve on there, but civilian workers who work on that. Many of my constituents that have been coming up to me, and Mr. Chairman, I can't go out in public without somebody coming up to me and saying, I'm one of the furloughed workers. I can't afford to lose those days. What are you going to do? Well, I think that's a legitimate ask of that person, and frankly, it's not one person. I can't go to a sporting event. Even in my own neighborhood, there are people asking me, what are we going to do to help them? Now, the answer here in this body has been mostly, well, if the DOD really wanted to make their pay whole, not give them furlough dates, they could do that. This is a political move by the President. Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm not willing to play that level of politics with my constituents' pay. So this amendment, what this amendment does, it moves $2.8 billion out of the Afghan Security Forces account. It reduces that account from $7.7 billion to $5.1 billion, moving it to an account that can be used to supplement those wages and eliminate the furloughs of 55,000 furloughed civilian workers working on our bases across the country. Now, does this cure every furlough? No. But it does the vast majority and gives the flexibility to the DOD to perhaps reduce the furloughs to the point where it's negligible impact on 100%. Now, let's talk about this fund, because there seems to be some confusion about this fund. On this fund, the Afghan Security Forces account, this is the fund of which the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, or SIGAR, has uncovered $2 billion, Mr. Chairman, of waste, fraud, and abuse. This is that fund that has been in the paper a lot lately for building bases that nobody wanted and nobody's using. This is the fund of which bought Russian helicopters for the Afghan military that no one knows how to fly, and they're sitting there rusting. This is basically a type of slush fund to be used for special projects that have been made, accusations have been made, or simply lining the pockets of some Afghani officials. So all we're doing is reducing it, basically the amount of proven fraud within this fund. So the reality here is we reduce the fund and we save our own civilian employees that go to work every day but now have been told to stay home for a certain amount of days, and we can protect those workers. Let's focus on U.S. workers, those working on our base. Let's make them the priority, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Indiana.
I would claim time in opposition to the gentleman's amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I appreciate that, and given the time limitation, I would address the issue of furloughs that the gentleman makes. Furloughs are a result of the Budget Control Act that was passed in 2011. It's a result of sequestration that occurred because of the adoption of that law. The gentleman who has offered the amendment voted for that act that has caused sequestration to occur that now is causing furloughs to take place. I would point out that I think it is patently wrong to carve out any class of federal civilian employees to the detriment of others. I mentioned in my opening statement that I thought it was wrong for the 4th year in a row we are not providing a pay raise for any federal civilian employee at the Department of Defense, which essentially represents a revenue loss to those employees working for the people of this country of $437 million. So it is not lack of sympathy for those who are losing a portion of that paycheck over and above that pay freeze for the last 4 years. That is the cause of my concern. But I would point out to all of my colleagues that other government agencies have also decided to use furloughs, and as the gentleman rightly pointed out, he doesn't solve all of those problems. They include the Department of Labor, the Internal Revenue Service, the Environmental Protection Agency, Housing and Urban Development, the Department of Justice, Office of Management and Budget. While this bill under consideration doesn't fund these agencies, where is the outcry? Where is the concern for those federal employees, and who is speaking for them now? 3 fiscal year 2014 appropriation bills have passed the House. While the Department of Veterans Affairs was exempted entirely from sequestration under the Budget Control Act, that the gentleman voted for. No furlough exemptions were granted within the other 2 bills. There was no hedging of funds to avert furloughs for them, for bills that have already been considered by this body and passed by this House without this type of exemption. Allowing exemptions for one agency is unfair to others. Allowing exemptions pit one agency against another agency and wrongfully determines the value of work performed by one federal employee vis-a-vis another, depending on what department they work in. If we value the work of our government employees, we should seek to block all scheduled furloughs, not selected few. We should end sequestration, and I did not vote for the Budget Control Act. Until we fix this problem, The work of the government will not be done as efficiently and as effectively as possible. Maybe parts will not be bought. Maybe maintenance will be deferred. Maybe somebody is going to lose their job because the contract is not let. Maybe someone is furloughed. But we should not temporarily fix one dislocation caused by sequestration that only defers decisions of substance that need to be made today going forward. So again, I would strongly oppose the gentleman's amendment and would reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves.
To the chair.
The gentleman from Florida.
How much time has remaining?
A minute and a half remaining.
I don't have a lot of confidence that when the American troops are out of Afghanistan, that it's going to be any different than it was when the American troops went to Afghanistan. And we have paid a dear price for our involvement there. But on the hope that maybe the Afghanistan security force will shape up and do what we think, and that is to keep Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah and all of the other terrorist groups, keep them away from creating more trouble for the United States and becoming breeding grounds and training grounds. So therefore, I have to oppose the amendment. But I just do not have a lot of confidence in this government and this Afghan security force. I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Nebraska.
Yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from California.
30 seconds. Recognize the gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, if you don't trust the Afghan government, you should never give them $2.6 billion. This is on top of the $5 billion that they were to receive. This money was specifically added to the budget for the Afghan military to buy something. Air parts, airplanes. We have absolutely no idea what they're going to do with this money. We would never, under any circumstance, give our own military a blank $2.6 billion blank check, but that's exactly what we're doing here. You're asking for fraud. You're asking for abuse. We should bring this money back and make sure our own people are doing the work that the Defense Department needs. I yield back my time.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Indiana.
And I would reclaim the balance of my time if I could.
The gentleman is recognized.
As the U.S. draws down forces, and I appreciate the Chairman's remarks for the post-2014 security environment, we should prepare to leave Afghanistan on positive terms. As we depart, the U.S. should help repair a nation torn by years of war with the means to develop itself and to move beyond the past conflict, and so also am opposed to the means to finance the gentleman's amendment and would yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields the balance of his time. Recognize gentleman from Nebraska.
Mr. Chairman, the issue before us, the vote is, will you vote yes for our civilian employees working on the base, or will you vote no, which says, I support the waste, fraud, and abuse in this fund? I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Nebraska. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote. That's all I have.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Nebraska will be postponed. It is now in order to consider amendment number. For what reason did the gentleman rise?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 25, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Mr. Poe of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
I thank the chairman. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
My amendment cuts aid to Pakistan in this bill in half. This is the same amendment that passed this House last year by voice vote. Pakistan seems to be the Benedict Arnold nation in the list of countries that we call allies. They have proven to be deceptive, deceitful, and a danger to the United States. The day that Osama bin Laden met his maker will go down in history as an important moment. Our manhunt did not end in a remote cave in the mountains, but in a palace in a bustling military town 35 miles from Islamabad. To think that the most senior levels of the Pakistani government did not know he was there requires, as Secretary Clinton has said, the willing suspension of disbelief. Soon after our suspicions were confirmed, instead of celebrating with us the capture of the #1 terrorist in the world, Pakistan arrested the one person that helped the United States capture Osama bin Laden. And last year, Pakistan sentenced Dr. Al-Fadi to 33 years in prison. In February of 2012, a NATO report said ISI, which is Pakistan's CIA, is aiding the Taliban and other extremist groups in Afghanistan and Pakistan by providing resources, sanctuary, and training. In June of 2011, Pakistan tipped off terrorists making IEDs not once but twice after we told them where the bomb-making factories were and Pakistan to go after them. But they did not. They told the terrorists that we were coming. Throughout 2011, Pakistan tried to cheat the United States by filing bogus reimbursement claims for allegedly going after militants when they weren't even doing that. On September 22, 2011, Admiral Mike Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee that, quote, with ISI support, Afghani operatives planned and conducted the truck bomb that attacked as well as an assault on the U.S. Embassy. The truck bombing he mentions were where wounded Americans, up to 70 Americans and NATO troops, were injured because of that bombing. Admiral Mullen went on to say that this terrorist network acts as the arm of the Pakistan's International Inter-Services Intelligence Agency. It doesn't seem to me that Pakistan deserves any more of our money. We've been doing the same thing for the last 10 years. Since 2002, Pakistan has collected a total of $26 billion of American money. And what have we gotten in return? Treachery. It's time for a new strategy with Pakistan. There are some who say we need to pay Pakistan to help with our withdrawal. All the shutting down of the southern route showed that we don't need Pakistan. We were able to pursue our mission even though they shut down that route. What really endangers our troops is not whether or not we have a southern supply route, but whether or not we have access to Pakistan's tribal areas. And of course, that has been off limits, according to the Pakistan government. This bill gives Pakistan over $1 billion. Cutting funding in half hopefully will send a message long overdue to the Pakistanis that they can't play us anymore, that we mean business. And to add a few more comments, Mr. Chairman, a poll conducted in Pakistan, the Pakistanis, 64% of the Pakistanis consider the United States the enemy, and yet we are paying them $1 billion a year? Doesn't make any sense to me. Plus, Americans who have an unfavorable view of Pakistan is 81%. So why do we pay Pakistan to be our enemy? Why do we pay them to hate us? Mr. Speaker or Mr. Chairman, I submit they will do both of those things for free, and I will reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman